Saint Augustine on the Most Holy Trinity, Book 10, Chapter 5. Why the soul is enjoined to know itself, whence come the errors of the mind concerning its own substance. Why, therefore, is it enjoined upon it that it should know itself? I suppose in order that it may consider itself and live according to its own nature, that is, seek to be regulated according to its own nature, vice under him to whom it ought to be subject and above those things to which it is to be preferred, under him by whom it ought to be ruled above things which it ought to rule. For it does many things through vicious desire, as though in forgetfulness of itself. For it sees some things intrinsically excellent in that more excellent nature which is God, and whereas it ought to remain steadfast, that it may enjoy them, it is turned away from him by wishing to appropriate those things to itself, and not to be like to him by his gift, but to be what he is by its own, and it begins to move and slip gradually down into less and less, which it thinks to be more and more. For it is neither sufficient for itself, nor is anything at all sufficient for it, if it withdraw from him who is alone sufficient. And so through want and distress it becomes too intent upon its own actions, and upon the unquiet delights which it obtains through them. And thus, by the desire of acquiring knowledge from those things that are without, the nature of which it knows and loves, and which it feels can be lost unless held fast with anxious care, it loses its security and thinks of itself so much the less in proportion to as it feels the more secure that it cannot see itself. So whereas it is one thing not to know oneself, and another not to think of oneself, for we do not say of the man that is skilled in much learning that he is ignorant of grammar, when he is only not thinking of it, because he is thinking at the time of the art of medicine. Whereas then I say, it is one thing not to know oneself, and another not to think of oneself. Such is the strength of love, that the mind draws in with itself those things which it has long thought of with love, and has grown into them by the close adherence of diligent study, even when it returns in some way to think of itself. And because these things are corporeal, which it loved externally through the carnal senses, and because it has become entangled with them by a kind of daily familiarity, and yet can't carry those corporeal things themselves with itself internally, as it were into the region of incorporeal nature, therefore it combines certain images of them and thrusts them thus made from itself into itself. For it gives to the forming of them somewhat of its own substance, yet preserves the while something by which it may judge freely of the species of those images, and this something is more properly the mind, that is, the rational understanding, which is preserved that it may judge. For we see that we have two parts of the soul which are informed by the likeness of corporeal things, in common also with beasts. Chapter 6. The opinion which the mind has of itself is deceitful. But the mind errs when it so lovingly and intimately connects itself with these images as even to consider itself to be something of the same kind, for so it is conformed to them to some extent, not by being this, but by thinking it is so. Not that it thinks itself to be an image, but outright that very thing itself of which it entertains the image. For there still lives in it the power of distinguishing the corporeal thing which it leaves without from the image of that corporeal thing which it contains therefrom within itself, except when these images are so projected as if felt without and not thought within, as in the case of people who are asleep or made in a trance. Chapter 7. The opinions of philosophers respecting the substance of the soul. The error of those who are of opinions that the soul is corporeal does not arise from defective knowledge of the soul, but from their adding there to something foreign to it, what is meant by finding. This was the content of chapter 7. When therefore it thinks itself to be something of this kind, it thinks itself to be a corporeal thing, and since it is perfectly conscious of its own superiority by which it rules the body, it has hence come to pass that the question has been raised what part of the body has the greater power in the body, and the opinion has been held that this is the mind, nay, that it is even the whole soul altogether. And some accordingly think it to be the blood, others the brain, others the heart, not as the Scripture says, I will praise thee, O Lord, with all my heart, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart. For this word by misapplication or metaphor is transferred from the body to the soul, but they have simply thought it to be that small part itself of the body which we see when the inward parts are rent asunder. Others again have believed the soul to be made up of very minute and individual corpuscles, which they call atoms, meeting in themselves and cohering. Others have said that its substance is air, others fire. Others have been of opinion that it is no substance at all, since they could not think any substance unless it is body, and they did not find that the soul was body. But it was in their opinion the tempering together itself of our body, or the combining together of the elements, by which that flesh is, as it were, conjoined. And hence all of these have held the soul to be mortal, since whether it were body or some combination of body, certainly it could not in either case continue always without death. But they who have held its substance to be some kind of life, the reverse of corporeal, since they have found it to be a life that animates and quickens every living body, have by consequence striven also, according as each was able, to prove it immortal, since life can't be without life. For as that fifth kind of body, I know not what which some have added to the four well-known elements of the world, and have said that the soul was made of this, I do not think we need spend time in discussing it in this place. For either they mean by body what we mean by it, viz. That of which a part is less than the whole in extension of place, and they are to be reckoned among those who have believed the mind to be corporeal. Or if they call either all substance or all changeable substance body, whereas they know that not all substance is contained in extension of place by any length and breadth and height, we need not contend with them about a question of words. Now, in the case of all these opinions, anyone who sees that the nature of the mind is at one substance and yet not corporeal, that is, that it does not occupy a less extension of place with a less part of itself, and a greater with a greater, must needs see at the same time that they who are of opinion that it is corporeal do not err from defect of knowledge concerning mind, but because they associate with it qualities without which they are not able to conceive any nature at all. For if you bid them conceive of existence that is without corporeal phantasms, they hold it merely nothing, and so the mind would not seek itself as though wanting to itself. For what is so present to knowledge as that which is present to the mind? Or what is so present to the mind as the mind itself? And hence what is called invention, if we consider the origin of the word, what else does it mean unless that to find out is to come into that which is sought? Those things accordingly which come into the mind as it were of themselves are not usually said to be found out, although they may be said to be known, since we did not endeavor by seeking to come into them, that is, to invent or find them out. And therefore, as the mind itself really seeks those things which are sought by the eyes or by any other sense of the body, for the mind directs even the carnal sense, and then finds out or invents when that sense comes to the things which are sought, so too it finds out or invents other things which it ought to know, not with the medium of corporeal sense, but through itself when it comes into them, and this whether in the case of the higher substance that is God, or of the other parts of the soul, just as it does when it judges of bodily images themselves, for it finds these within in the soul impressed through the body. Chapter 8. The soul inquires into itself, whence comes the error of the soul concerning itself. It is then a wonderful question in what manner the soul seeks and finds itself, at what it aims in order to seek, or whither it comes that it may come into or find out. For what is so much in the mind as the mind itself? But because it is in those things which it thinks of with love, and is wont to be insensible, that is, in corporeal things with love, it is unable to be in itself without the images of those corporeal things, and hence shameful error arises to block its way, whilst it can separate from itself the images of sensible things, so as to see itself alone. Sorry. And herein consists its uncleanness, since while it strives to think of itself alone, it fancies itself to be that without which it can think of itself. When therefore it is bidden to become acquainted with itself, let it not seek itself as though it were withdrawn from itself, but let it withdraw that which it has added to itself. For itself lies more deeply within, not only than those sensible things which are clearly without, but also than the images of them, which are indeed in some part of the soul, viz., that which beasts also have, although these want understanding, which is proper to the mind. As therefore the mind is within, it goes forth in some sort from itself, when it exerts the affection of love towards these, as it were, footprints of many acts of attention. And these footprints are, as it were, imprinted on the memory at the time when the corporeal things which are without are perceived in such way that even when those corporeal things are absent, yet the images of them are at hand to those who think of them. Therefore let the mind become acquainted with itself, and not seek itself as if it were absent, but fix upon itself the act of voluntary attention, by which it was wandering among other things, and let it think of itself. So it will see that at no time did it ever not love itself, at no time did it ever not know itself. But by loving another thing together with itself, it has confounded itself with it, and in some sense has grown one with it. And so while it embraces diverse things as though they were one, it has come to think those things to be one which are diverse. Chapter 9. The mind knows itself by the very act of understanding the precepts to know itself. Let it not therefore seek to discern itself as though absent, but take pains to discern itself as present. Nor let it take knowledge of itself as if it did not know itself, but let it distinguish itself from that which it knows to be another. For how will it take pains to obey that very precept which is given it, know thyself, if it knows not either what know means or what thyself means? But if it knows both, then it knows also itself. Since know thyself is not so said of the mind, as is know the cherubim and the seraphim, for they are absent, and we believe concerning them, and according to that belief they are declared to be certain celestial powers. Nor yet again as it is said, know the will of that man, for this it is not within our reach to perceive at all, either by sense or understanding, unless by corporeal signs actually set forth, and this in such a way that we rather believe than understand. Nor again as it is said to a man, behold thy own face, which he can only do in a looking glass. For even our own face itself is out of the reach of our own seeing it, because it is not there where our look can be directed. But when it is said to the mind, know thyself, then it knows itself by that very act by which it understands the word thyself, and this for no other reason than that it is present to itself. But if it does not understand what is said, then certainly it does not do as it is bid to do, and therefore it is bidden to do that thing which it does do when it understands the very precept that bids it. Chapter 10. Every mind knows certainly three things concerning itself, that it understands, that it is, and that it lives. Let it not then add anything to that which it knows itself to be when it is bidden to know itself. For it knows at any rate that this is said to itself, namely, to the self that is and that lives and that understands. But a dead body also is, and cattle live, but neither a dead body nor cattle understand. Therefore it so knows that it so is, and that it so lives, as an understanding is and lives. When therefore, for example's sake, the mind thinks itself air, it thinks that air understands. It knows, however, that itself understands, but it does not know itself to be air, but only thinks so. Let it separate that which it thinks itself, let it discern that which it knows. Let this remain to it about which not even have they doubted, who have thought the mind to be this corporeal thing or that. For certainly every mind does not consider itself to be air, but some think themselves fire, others the brain, and some one kind of corporeal thing, others another, as I have mentioned before. Yet all know that they themselves understand and are and live, but they prefer understanding to that which they understand but to be and to live to themselves. And no one doubts either that no one understands who does not live, or that no one lives of whom it is not true that he is, and that therefore by consequence that which understands both is and lives, not as a dead body is which does not live, nor as a soul lives, which does not understand, but in some proper and more excellent manner. Further, they know that they will, and they equally know that no one can will who is not and who does not live, and they also refer that will itself to something which they will with that will. They know also that they remember, and they know at the same time that nobody could remember unless he both was and lived, that we refer memory itself also to something, in that we remember those things. Therefore the knowledge and science of many things are contained in two of these three, memory and understanding, but will must be present that we may enjoy or use them. For we enjoy things known in which things themselves the will finds delight for their own sake and so reposes. But we use those things which we refer to some other thing which we are to enjoy. Neither is the life of man vicious and culpable in any other way than as wrongly using and wrongly enjoying, but it is no place here to discuss this. But since we treat of the nature of the mind, let us remove from our consideration all knowledge which is received from without through the senses of the body, and attend more carefully to the position which we have laid down, that all minds know and are certain concerning themselves. For men certainly have doubted whether the power of living, of remembering, of understanding, of willing, of thinking, knowing, judging, be of air or of fire, or of the brain, or of the blood, or of atoms, or besides the usual four elements of a fifth kind of body, I know not what, or whether the combining of or tempering together of this our flesh itself has power to accomplish these things. And one has attempted to establish this, and another to establish that. Yet whoever doubts that he himself lives and remembers and understands and wills and thinks and knows and judges, seeing that even if he doubts he lives, if he doubts he remembers why he doubts, if he doubts he understands that he doubts, and if he doubts he wishes to be certain. If he doubts he thinks, if he doubts he knows that he does not know, if he doubts he judges that he ought not to assent rashly. Whosoever therefore doubts about anything else ought not to doubt of all these things, which if they were not, he would not be able to doubt of anything. They who think the mind to be either a body or the combination or tempering of the body will have all these things to seem to be in a subject, so that the substance is air or fire or some other corporeal thing, which they think to be the mind, but that the understanding is in this corporeal thing as its quality, so that this corporeal thing is the subject, but the understanding is in the subject, viz., that the mind is the subject, which they judge to be a corporeal thing, but the understanding or any other of those things which we have mentioned as certain to us is in that subject. They also hold nearly the same opinion who deny the mind itself to be body, but think it to be the combination or tempering together of the body. For there is this difference, that the former say that the mind itself is the substance, in which the understanding is as in a subject, but the latter say that the mind itself is in a subject, viz., in the body, of which it is the combination or tempering together. And hence, by consequence, what else can they think except that the understanding also is in the same body as in a subject? And all these do not perceive that the mind knows itself even when it seeks for itself, as we have already shown. But nothing is at all rightly said to be known while its substance is not known, and therefore when the mind knows itself, it knows its own substance, and when it is certain about itself, it is certain about its own substance. But it is certain about itself as those things which are said above prove convincingly, although it is not at all certain whether itself is air or fire, or some body, or some function of body. Therefore it is any of these, and to that whole which is better to know itself belongs this, that it is certain that it is not any of those things of which it is certain, and is certain that it is that only which only it is certain that it is. For it thinks in this way of fire, air, or whatever else of the body it thinks of. Neither can it in any way be brought to pass that it should so think that which itself is as it thinks that which itself is not. Since it thinks all these things through an imaginary fantasy, whether fire, air, or this or that body, or that part or combination and tempering together of the body, not assuredly it is said to be all those things, but some one of them. But if it were any one of them, it would think this one in a different manner from the rest, viz. Not through an imaginary fantasy, as absent things are thought, which either themselves or some of like kind have been touched by the bodily sense, but by some inward, not faint, but true presence, for nothing is more present to it than itself. Just as it thinks that itself lives and remembers and understands and wills, for it knows these things in itself and does not imagine them as though it had touched them by the sense outside itself, as corporeal things are touched. And if it attaches nothing to itself from the thought of these things so as to think itself to be something of the kind, then whatsoever remains to it from itself, that alone is itself. Chapter 11. Content in memory, understanding, and will. We have to note ability, learning, and use. Memory, understanding, and will are one essentially and three relatively. Putting aside then for a little while all other things of which the mind is certain concerning itself, let us especially consider and discuss these three: memory, understanding, will. For we may commonly discern in these three the character of the abilities of the young also, since the more tenaciously and easily a boy remembers, and the more acutely he understands, and the more ardently he studies, the more praiseworthy is he in point of ability. But when the question is about anyone's learning, then we ask not how solidly and easily he remembers, or how shrewdly he understands, but what it is that he remembers and what it is that he understands. And because the mind is regarded as praiseworthy, not only as being learned, but also as being good, one gives heed not only to what he remembers and what he understands, but also to what he wills, not how ardently he wills, but first what it is he wills, and then how greatly he wills it. For the mind that loves eagerly is then to be praised when it loves that which ought to be loved eagerly. Since then we speak of these three: ability, knowledge, use, the first of these is to be considered under the three heads of what a man can do in memory and understanding and will. The second of them is to be considered in regard to that which anyone has in his memory and in his understanding, which he has attained by a studious will. But the third, viz., use, lies in the will, which handles those things that are contained in the memory and understanding, whether it refer them to anything further, or rest satisfied with them as an end. For to use is to take something into the power of the will, and to enjoy is to use with joy, not any longer of hope, but of the actual thing. Accordingly, everyone who enjoys uses, for he takes up something into the power of the will, wherein he also is satisfied as with an end, but not every one who uses enjoys, if he has sought after that which he takes up into the power of the will, not on account of the thing itself, but on account of something else. Since then